Hello, everyone. My name is Carla Long, and I'm the pastor of the Salt Lake City Community of Christ. And it's a really interesting congregation because we don't actually have a lot of long-time, lifetime members of Community of Christ. We have a lot of people who have converted to Community of Christ, and it's been a wonderful experience. And I get a lot of questions all the time. And one of the questions that I get is about baptism for the dead. Uh, Community Christ people ask me, what is baptism for the dead? And people who have left the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints ask me, when did we get rid of it? Why did we get rid of it? And ask me all about how we feel about baptism for the dead. And since I don't always know all of the answers to those questions, I thought I would ask an expert. And so we're going to be interviewing Locke Mackay today, and Locke is an apostle with Community of Christ. Hello, Locke.
Hello, Carla. Good to be with you.
I'm so glad you're here because I have so many questions about baptism for the dead, both from the early days and from kind of a now perspective. So I'm so glad you're here, and I'm so glad that you're going to be answering these questions for us. But before we jump into that, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Sure. I was born and raised in eastern Jackson County, Missouri, not far from Independence. I ended up at University of Missouri studying Russian area studies and economics. Thought I was going to work for the government, but then discovered and fell in love with church history and have spent my entire adult life at Community of Christ Historic Sites. Currently live in Nauvoo, Illinois.
Oh, Nauvoo. I bet it's a really interesting place to live, actually. So, Locke, I think I'm ready to jump into it. So, can we just jump into baptism for the dead? Why it got started, who started it, all of the stuff that we need to know for the background information for Community of Christ people, actually, who may not understand what it's all about.
So I want to start by making it clear that our discussion today is on the historical relationship between the earliest church / Community of Christ and baptism for the dead, and that we rejected baptism for the dead, and it is not part of Community of Christ today. Our rejection of baptism for the dead is based on theology, not history. So we understand that there's only one Savior. It's Jesus, not genealogists, not men and boys performing proxy baptisms. And as we have increasingly embraced the focus on grace versus works, that has also played into our understandings of baptism for the dead and the need or not for it. Like many things in our history, Joseph Smith and his relationship to the requirement for baptism and the later baptism for the dead is complex, and it evolves during Joseph's lifetime. I want to just review quickly what I think is kind of the general understanding of the introduction of baptism for the dead based on my 15 years of experience at Kirtland Temple, talking with members of the Church of Jesus Christ. I think kind of the general understanding is that Joseph taught in 1832, based on section 76, that baptism was required in order to reach the celestial kingdom. I think there's kind of a general understanding that Joseph's vision of his brother Alvin, January 21st of 1836 on the third floor of the Kirtland Temple, is foreshadowing the introduction of baptism for the dead. That would later be canonized in 1876 in the LDS tradition. I think that's section 137. And that Joseph then introduced proxy baptisms for the deceased to the church in 1840 Nauvoo. Again, like so many things in our past, though, Joseph's understanding related to the need for baptism evolved during his lifetime. It is far more complex than generally understood. Among the resources I've used to better understand the development of this topic is Charles Harrell's "This Is My Doctrine: The Development of Mormon Theology," particularly helpful book on this topic and many others. Harrell notes that the Book of Mormon teaches that those who don't have a chance to hear the gospel are redeemed by the Lord. For them, baptism is not only unnecessary, it, quote, availeth nothing. Again, back to Joseph's vision, January 21st of 36, he sees his brother Alvin in the celestial kingdom, marvels how it is that he is there without having been baptized, Joseph is told that those who would have received it, meaning the gospel, if they had been permitted to tarry, are heirs to the celestial kingdom, and that we will be judged by the desires of our hearts. So baptism not necessary, not a requirement, will be judged by the desires of our hearts. Over the next few years, the idea develops that those without the law would have the opportunity to hear and receive it in spirit prison, but there's still no indication that proxy baptism was part of the equation yet. And even after that, Joseph taught, for example, in November 36, that baptism for the living was not a requirement, let alone for the dead. This maybe is a special case, but William Law, later a member of the First Presidency, writes to Isaac Russell in November of 1836 and shared that we had a blessing of a visit from Joseph Smith Jr. and Brother Sidney Rigdon. They were here for 4 or 5 days, from whom we received much information. One thing I would mention, he says, we have a right to administer to such as Sister Graham, who was prevented by their husbands from baptism. We may confirm such and give the sacrament, and etc. So again, baptism for the dead, not yet part of the equation. Joseph Smith Jr. does introduce baptism for the dead by proxy in 1840. Almost certainly it's rooted in his deep concern for the eternal well-being of his brother Alvin. Alvin was the oldest surviving Smith child. It's kind of the glue that held the family together. And his death in his mid-20s was just devastating for the family, and made worse by the fact that the minister at his funeral apparently suggested Alvin would burn eternally because he had not been baptized into a Christian faith. So as you can imagine, the Smith family deeply distraught by that. And Joseph spent the rest of his life concerned about the eternal well-being of his brother Alvin. So certainly played a role in the introduction of this, even though Joseph had been told in that Kirtland Temple vision, Alvin's okay, it's going to be okay. He's still concerned. It's kind of as an insurance policy, apparently, introduces this concept of baptism for the dead. When doing so, Joseph referenced 1 Corinthians chapter 15, verse 29. Else, what shall they do which are baptized for the dead, if the dead rise not at all? Why are they then baptized for the dead? It's worth noting that Paul doesn't endorse the practice. He doesn't condemn the practice. He just mentions that it's being done. And he doesn't make clear by who. Is it normative Christianity, or is it just a few, or is it those outside the church? And it's interesting that the voice changes from we, Paul is using we up to that point, but when he gets to the topic of baptism of the dead, he shifts to they, and then goes back to we. I think among modern scholars, there's an ongoing discussion, again, who's doing it. It doesn't seem to be normative. The shift to they suggests it's a small group, maybe inside the church, maybe out. Guy Bishop, now deceased, I believe, has a nice, concise article on baptism for the dead in Nauvoo. What has become of our fathers? Baptism for the dead at Nauvoo, again by M. Guy Bishop. He notes that it's first introduced publicly in August of 1840, when Joseph preached the funeral sermon for Seymour Brunson and publicly referenced the concept. And soon, by September of 1840, baptisms for the dead by proxy are being performed in the Mississippi River. During Joseph's lifetime, many women served as proxies for men, and many men served as proxies for women. But Brigham Young stopped that practice in 1845. Men only for men, women only for women after 45. Almost all baptisms for the dead in Nauvoo are done for family members. A very small percentage are done for, quote, friends, which might include George Washington and other founding fathers and mothers. But it was only supposed to be done for those who you believed would have accepted the gospel and they had a chance to hear it. At least one woman, Melissa Lott, served as a witness for a baptism for the dead by proxy in 1845. These are initially done in rivers like the Mississippi here in Nauvoo, or the east branch of the Chagrin River in Kirtland, Ohio. But Joseph very soon put a stop to that and said that they could only be done in a temple. almost certainly to provide encouragement to get to work on the Nauvoo temple. Another really helpful resource is Roger Launius's An Ambivalent Rejection, Baptism for the Dead, and the Reorganized Church Experience. And he talks about how we kind of interacted with the concept in the early reorganization and later. The position in the early RLDS church seems to be stated pretty well by William Marks in a May 1865 joint council meeting. Marks was the stake president here in 1840s Nauvoo, had a very good understanding of what was happening in the church, both publicly and privately. And Marks shared in this meeting that the doctrine had originally been considered a permissive rite to be practiced only under the most restricted conditions in a temple built especially for the purpose. Marks asserted that Joseph Smith had stopped the practice for a time, at least for a time in Nauvoo, and Marks believed that it would not be practiced again until there was a fountain built in Zion or Jerusalem. So this idea that it was only for a particular time and place in Nauvoo, and that if it was going to happen again, there needed to be further light, a revelation or something to suggest it should be started again. And that became kind of the foundation of the reorganization's understandings related to baptism for the dead. It can only be practiced in the temple. We didn't have a temple to practice it in. So it's just kind of on the shelf and not to be picked up again until there's further revelatory understanding. So when I tell people that in the early church we were universalists, they sometimes don't believe me. They want to push back on that. Of course, section 76, I think, makes that pretty clear, with just the small exception of the sons, not the daughters, just the sons of perdition. But I just ran across another really interesting letter from Joseph Smith III to Job Brown, 5 January of 1886. This is in the Launius article that drives home that point. Joseph III is saying that he believed in the principle of universal salvation, and that baptism for the dead was one means of achieving it. But, quote, I do not teach it, having, as I understand it, no command to do so. So that kind of mid to late 19th century RLDS perspective, it's perhaps okay to perform baptism for the dead in the past and may begin in the future, but until there's a commandment to do it, we have no temple to do it in, so it's just kind of there on the shelf.
You know, I find it super interesting. Let me just say it this way. When you look at baptism for the dead, it is something that is actually quite beautiful. It's a really lovely thing that people want to do for another person, so that they don't burn in hell or whatever was the beliefs back then. And so when I think about it, I think it's very kind. But, when I really think about it with my theological mind, I'm like, gosh, for me, it just doesn't feel necessary at all. When you look at, grace and works and how we've moved into a grace-filled place, it just doesn't seem like it's something that is necessary at all. So I'm really grateful we moved into the grace part of it. But I do think it's a beautiful thing that people want to do for their relatives or their friends or their whatever,
Yeah, I think it makes perfect sense to care about your deceased loved ones. But what you're saying is the position that we would ultimately land on as well, that it's simply not essential. Baptism, not essential for salvation, either for the living or the dead.
Yeah, Okay, so that was in 1886. Did you have anything else that you wanted to talk about from 1886 in that era, or do you just want to jump back into it?
Let's just jump back into it. In April 9 of 1886, our general conference, what would become world conferences, took conference action on baptism for the dead, among other things. We said that baptism for the dead belongs to those local questions of which the body has said by resolution, quote, that the commandments of a local character given to the first organization of the church are binding on the reorganization, only so far as they are either reiterated or referred to as binding by commandments to this church, end quote. And they continued, and that principle has neither been reiterated nor referred to as a commandment, a reference to baptism for the dead. So that was our position for basically the second half of the 19th century. And it's there. We understand it to be local in nature, and until there's further revelation received on it, it's just kind of out there. So that began to change in the early 20th century. Although the official position remained constant, the idea that the doctrine was permissive to be practiced at some future unspecified time. So that stays constant, but members and leaders started to raise questions about the doctrine, and it's much less common. The discussion is much less common during the first half of the 20th century than it had been before that time. There's not many references in the Saints Herald, our church periodical, to it. The number of references drops drastically, and the discussion moves from, should we and when, to it really only starts to come up in the 20th century when we talk about debates with our friends in Utah about baptism for the dead. So again, the debate becomes not so much about when, but about if, or whether it's necessary at all. Courtesy of the church in Utah, it becomes even a more significant issue for us again, though, by about 1948, starts to rise to the surface again, courtesy of Russell Ralston, a 70 in the church assigned to Utah. We were so far removed from Nauvoo by that time that our earlier take on baptism for the dead was just not really significant in us anymore. And it allowed us to start looking at these questions with new eyes, particularly Russell Ralston looking with new eyes. And he concluded that baptism for the dead was not essential for salvation. He understood that its practice was strictly limited to the Nauvoo temple. And he returned to that 1 Corinthians passage and Paul's use of they versus we to argue that it was not a Christian practice. He said, talking to the saints, members of Christ Church at Corinth, he says, else what shall they do which are baptized for the dead, if the dead rise not at all? Why are they then baptized for the dead? So Ralston argued that you'll note carefully that Paul does not say, why are you or we, members of Christ Church, baptized for the dead, but specifically they. Ralston's question, who are they? There is no indication that they are Christians, was Ralston's take. He concluded that the only logical conclusion is that baptism for the dead is not a basic principle of the doctrine of Christ. And this would become a central argument for the RLDS members against baptism for the dead for a time. He continued his research and study on the topic, and he eventually lifted up 6 basic conclusions that would become important for us. That baptism for the dead is at best strictly limited, that there is no temple on the earth where baptism for the dead can be practiced according to the limitations of God, that baptism for the dead is in no way essential to the salvation of either the living or the dead, that baptism for the dead is not a basic principle of Christ's gospel, of the Book of Mormon, since the Book of Mormon doesn't teach it. It's not a basic principle of Christ's gospel, and that the doctrine is at best permissible and only under very specific conditions. Finally, members of the Reorganized Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints cannot feel justified either in accepting or rejecting it, nor can we rightfully do so unless God and his wisdom shall reveal it in such a way and with such a purpose that it will be completely consistent with him, his son, and his gospel. That's Ralston's language in 1950.
So, Locke, that was in 1950 that you're talking about right now, that the stuff that you're just talking about. Where were people at that time? Was it like still in the minds and hearts of the people in the Restoration, or had it kind of just died out by then?
It was probably a combination of both. I think Ralston was probably kind of on the leading edge of pushing back, again, because he was in Utah. For most of our members, it was simply not a question that was coming up. So, probably mentioned, as Alma Blair said, to ignore is to reject. So it just is slowly either on the shelf or fading from understandings. It does get picked up again as Ralston starts to go into more detail.
I gotta say, I feel a certain kinship with Ralston. I mean, he's here in Utah. He's obviously in a minority. They have similar backgrounds with the LDS Church, but not similar at all in a lot of ways. And I mean, I get approached all the time by people asking about these differences, asking why, asking and it kind of I don't always know the answers. I don't always know exactly what they're talking about. So, he is being bombarded by all of these questions all the time. I totally get it. I'm feeling a real kinship with Russell Ralston right now, actually.
I love
Okay,
it.
so let's keep on moving on. I think we're going to go on to 1960. So let's do it.
So we take another step in that direction in 1960. This is again the writings of these two men. It's not yet the church, but in 1960 they say, while the reorganized church does not completely reject the principle of baptism for the dead, it does very strongly deny any concept which makes baptism for the dead essential to the salvation of either the living or the dead. That's a pretty strong statement. Lanius also notes, again, a lot of this I'm drawing from Roger Lanius, that their most interesting and original argument for the rejection of baptism for the dead is that the doctrine makes humans the saviors of those for whom they are baptized, rather than Jesus Christ. If salvation for the unbaptized people on the other side must depend upon frail mankind today, upon one's own life, they wrote. So clearly there's still a works emphasis there. Any doctrinal concept that makes man a savior is obviously false. That's 1960 language. So I was kind of surprised to discover that the argument I started with today actually originates with these two in 1960. It's not new. But what I think is newer, not new, but newer, is also the emphasis on grace versus works. Also developing in the 1960s, an argument that the sections in the Doctrine and Covenants mandating baptism for the dead had not been officially adopted by conference action of the church before the death of Joseph Smith, and therefore should not be binding on the church. So as a result, some church officials began advocating that these sections be removed from the Doctrine and Covenants. So these were members and leaders who were not fans of the concept, and this would eventually provide a rationale for why they would be removed from the Doctrine and Covenants. Again, the argument, they had not been officially adopted by conference action before Joseph's death and were therefore not binding. It comes up in the April 1968 World Conference, again, courtesy of the church in Utah. Utah District proposed including in a new edition of the Doctrine and Covenants only those revelations, quote, attested by Joseph Smith Jr. or by one of his lawful successors, end quote, presented to and acted upon by the presiding quorums of the church as revelation authoritatively binding upon the whole church. So they're saying we should remove those sections not accepted by the early church or later. And they also said that sections not considered revelatory and binding upon the reorganization were to be placed in a historical appendix. This resolution was passed on 6 April 1968, but did not designate which sections should come out of the canonized book and be added to the appendix. But that does set the stage for 1970, World Conference Resolution 1080, April 7th, again, 1970. There's a resolution presented that in addition to the historical appendix creation, there should be a new introduction to the Doctrine and Covenants, a new order for the sections in the book, so some were renumbered, and a new set of introductions to individual revelations. There was actually significant debate on this resolution. Again, some of those debating wanted to keep these Doctrine and Covenants sections related to baptism for the dead in the canonized section of the book because it was meaningful to them. Significant debate, but it ended up passing very easily. So that's, again, World Conference Resolution 1080. It moved the 3 sections in our Doctrine and Covenants related to baptism for the dead to the historical appendix. That was section 107, which is LDS 124, sections 109 and 110, which are LDS sections 127 and 128. They were letters written by Joseph while in hiding. So those 3 sections, 1970, removed to the historical appendix. We also at that time moved section 113, which is LDS 135. It's John Taylor's eulogy for Joseph Smith. That also moved to the historical appendix. And section 123, which were the minutes of an 1894 joint council meeting, also moved because they weren't considered revelatory, also moved to the appendix. So basically the final chapter for baptism for the dead and Community of Christ comes in 1990. A resolution comes to our World Conference from the church in Zaire in Africa. Once passed, it becomes World Conference Resolution 1215. And what the folks in Africa were arguing is that members and friends of the church there were getting confused. It was hard to distinguish between the Doctrine and Covenants and the sections that are canonized and the Doctrine and Covenants and the sections that are in the appendix. So we kept finding ourselves having to try and defend something that was no longer canon, but was still in the book. So because of that, the resolution read, resolved that the World Conference authorize the removal of the historical appendix of the Book of Doctrine and Covenants from all future publications of the book, and that they make the information available in the church's historical materials. And that resolution passed. And so, as Dick Howard has said, the Doctrine and Covenants was given an appendectomy in 1990.
Locke, I am shook. I had no idea that this resolution came from the folks of Zaire. Like that blows my mind. So like I'm actually pretty proud that like this kind of started in Utah and now I have a connection with the folks in Zaire. So what was the argument for them wanting to get rid of it?
That confusion, having to defend something that was really no longer part of us because it was still in the book. It was confusing folks.
Well, yes, you said that. I think I was reeling from the news of Zaire when you said it. So I really love that came from them and that it proves that we're a worldwide church, that we listen to our people, that we do what our people need and want us to do if it's voted on at World Conference, of course. So I think we're coming to a close of this interview, Locke, and I've really, really appreciated it. But I just want to be crystal clear. To your knowledge, baptism for the dead was never something that happened in the reorganization. From 1860 on, in the RLDS Church, baptism for the dead did not happen.
I've seen no sources that have baptism for the dead being practiced in the reorganization. I think we had members and leaders early who embraced the concept, but in a very limited fashion, initially only in Nauvoo in the temple, and not again until there was further revelation received on it, which of course never happened. So again, I have seen no sources that reflect baptism for the dead being practiced in the reorganization. John Hamer tells me that James Strang's followers were doing some baptism for the dead, and I believe him, but I've seen nothing in the reorganization.
Well, that is very, very helpful for me to know as a minister to seekers, because I do get asked that question, and it's really good that I've heard it from you. So I feel very confident in saying it after that. Well, Locke, thank you so much for helping us out and helping us learn more about baptism for the dead in the reorganization, which did not happen. And I'm really grateful that now I can talk about how Utah has a connection with Zaire in the RLDS church, and I think that that's really cool.
Always a joy to be with you.
Thank you so much, Locke.
Bye.